lot of
Sorry.
right, and Dan does a lot of modeling of oceanographic things and is able to kind of forward and backward project a lot of data and things like that. Lots of exciting things, but we were meant to have a talk from him a few weeks ago, and luckily we've been able to slot him in now. So I'm just going to let Dan introduce his talk. And all I want to say is that Dan has been a brilliant ally of people from minorities and people with mental health issues and all sorts of things within BAS. And he's real living proof that you don't have to be loud and annoying like me to have a significant impact when it comes to these issues. So I'll let him take it from there.
Oh, Hugh, thank you for saying that. That was really nice to hear. I feel a bit humbled by that. And so I thanks very much for the invitation to come talk today. And I think I'm feeling a little bit nervous or a little bit uncertain because I'm not sure if I have gotten the kind of tone of this talk right. And I struggled to come up with a clear, like a take-home message. But I'm usually okay at, like, if I just start talking, something happens usually. So we'll try that. And I have some slides, and there's somewhat of a through line through there, I guess. Oops, sorry. So I really don't have research slides. Like, I'm not presenting a science talk, right? Like, this is more about my kind of pathway into science and what that has kind of looked like along the way. And I thought I would try. I didn't want to just present some, rosy narrative with all of the only the positives and all of the negatives kind of airbrushed out. So I want to try to be a little bit more vulnerable and share both the things that worked well and that were nice and maybe could be seen as positives in my pathway, and then maybe the things that weren't so great. So I'm gonna give it a go. Yeah, this is a very different kind of talk for me, and so thanks for giving me some space to try this out. Or we could just look at some papers. So we could just, instead of being vulnerable, we could just look at science papers and talk about that. Okay, no, I'm kidding. Let's go to this. Okay. So I think I had some title that I hastily sent around, something about from astrophysics to oceanography, and that's kind of true, but it doesn't really capture a bit of what my pathway looked like. This is a photo that I took outside of South Georgia in the Southern Ocean, which I was privileged enough to get to go down there just the one time, and that was a really good experience, which I'll talk about a little bit near the end. But it really doesn't make up that much of the talk. So if we're kind of starting at the beginning, so I thought I would take you on a little geographic tour of some of the places. I'm just moving you all around. Don't mind me. I would take you on a little geographic tour of some of the places that have been relevant for me. So I was born in Savannah, Georgia, there on the coast. I don't remember it super well in terms of growing up because when I was 3 or so, we moved inland to Bullock County, Georgia, which is one of the big counties there. It has the most miles of dirt roads, which you can see here. It has the most miles of dirt roads of any county in Georgia. So it was quite rural, 30, 45 minutes to an hour to drive anywhere. The drive from that dot to Savannah is like an hour and a half. So if you want to get to, that was the big city for me growing up, was Savannah. And Savannah's really not that big, but it was big enough to, have like, I don't know, big outlet stores and things. The drive from here to Atlanta is like 3.5 to 4 hours. So Atlanta was not actually a big part of my life growing up because it was so far away. It's we would go there very occasionally for a concert or for like sports, like a Braves game or something, but that didn't happen very often at all. So most of my life was down here in the rural southeast part of Georgia. And like I said, that's one of the dirt roads that's near where I grew up. And that's a lot of what Bullock County looks like. That picture is me on the left, and that's my son when he was 3. we went back there for a visit, and that's me and him walking around with him still in his PJs. And the big picture there, that's my dad there with my son. So that's a couple of generations spanned there. So this part of Georgia is, like I said, it's rural and pretty conservative, pretty religious. I'm not personally religious anymore, but I was growing up for a time. It was just there, kind of soaking in it, you know. Um, and that's a whole other story that I won't that I won't delve into right now. But uh, I think I wanted to tell you some positives and negatives, but I kind of struggled with coming up with clean positives and negatives because growing up here was complex in some ways. It was good in some ways and complex in some ways that I think are a bit too much to get into right now. So I want to skip ahead a little bit to I did my undergrad down in Statesboro, Georgia, from the last slide at Georgia Southern University. And for grad school, I went to University of Kentucky there in Lexington, Kentucky. And I was married to Steph already, to my wife. Some of you know Steph. We got married back in 2003. And so she's been with me since, we've been married since middle of my kind of undergrad career. And what I was doing there, I was doing astrophysics as my research. And I was working with some people that I found pretty intense. My experience with astrophysics is that it's kind of filled with a lot of really hyper competitive workaholics. That was my experience with it. I'm not trying to generalize and say that all of astrophysics is like that, but it did not necessarily feel like the healthiest field to be in from a mental health kind of perspective. I was really excited. My wife and I both were really excited to be in a new city. That was our first time really living far away from our parents. We went to undergrad pretty close to where we grew up, so it didn't feel that different. But our experience in Lexington, that was a new city. We made all new friends, good friends. And all of that was really, really brilliant. It was kind of our first time, like, we felt a little bit more like adults because we were really living out by ourselves, without a pre-established network somewhere. And the pictures over here, most of what I did get to do some research, but I mostly worked on this stack of papers here. The 2 years of physics homework, I just did endless problem sets and tests and things, and that was what my master's was like. I think I learned something, maybe. I think I at least learned how to be persistent. I don't necessarily think it made me smarter. I don't know if that's the right way to think about it. I think it just like taught me how to get through something, which is kind of a lot of what you need for like a PhD is just that persistence. A PhD is not a measure of intelligence. It's a measure of stick-to-itiveness of how, you can just grab onto a problem and not let go and keep working at it and keep working at it. Some of that picture on the right, that's me as Harvey Birdman being choked by a prisoner friend of mine who was also in the grad school program with me at a Halloween party. So he's I'm still in touch with him. I made some good friends during that period. Some of the negatives, I really fell into a bit of workaholism there. I was really just working all the time, producing this stack of papers is pretty much what I was doing. But at the same time, I felt really crushing imposter syndrome. It was so in my undergrad, I hope this doesn't sound immodest, but I kind of stood out in my undergrad program. It was a small program, so like if you were somebody who was interested in your subject, you really could stand out quite a lot. And I cared about the material and I cared about doing well, so that alone was enough to make me stand out. It was a bit of a big fish in a small pond situation in my undergrad, which is kind of a good thing. I think that can be all right. It can build your confidence. If you get to be a big fish in a small pond, it can give you some room to grow, and it can help you just feel like, yeah, okay, I can do something. But at Kentucky, I was working. The other students there were so crazy smart. There was a string theorist from Brazil who just blew everybody out of the water in terms of his intelligence and skill. And so that meant that the program was kind of a breeding ground for imposter syndrome. The faculty weren't that supportive. The faculty were kind of mostly just they expected you to just get on with it and produce excellent results. So it wasn't the most supportive, environment from a faculty kind of standpoint, which is okay. And I wanted to be honest with you all. I mean, I probably was drinking too much at the time, and that wasn't healthy. I'm not saying that to glorify it, like it was part of my coping mechanism at the time, and it wasn't healthy. So I'm glad to have a better relationship with that now. After that, I I got a job teaching physics, and I really loved this job. So I taught physics and astronomy back at what was my undergrad university, Georgia Southern University in Statesboro, and Statesboro is close to where I grew up. There is a picture of me in my office. Um, got some math there on the background, and yeah, honestly, this job suited me really well. I liked helping students. I liked talking about physics and astronomy, and I liked feeling like I was doing something positive by kind of helping people discover new things and learn new things and learn about themselves as well. Because as an instructor, it's so nice to help people learn how they learn and help people learn how to, help young people kind of and older people too. You get older students as there as well. Like you help them learn how they learn complex and sophisticated material. Um, I probably would still be doing this job had the financial crash not evaporated my contract, because this was 2007 to 2009. So financial crash was happening right around then, and that basically meant that my teaching contract evaporated. That's in the bottom right. That's me, and then that's my wife there, and a couple of good friends of ours. Uh, the other friend here, she lives up in Newcastle now. She also moved to the UK. And here in the end, Chris, he has moved to Boulder, Colorado. He lived up in Newcastle and Durham for a while. So there was a period where we were all over here in the UK. This picture's from like 2008 in Charleston, South Carolina. These big kind of knotty, beautiful trees are all over the place down there. That part of it's really gorgeous. So yeah, what was good about it? Well, I was teaching physics, like I said, I loved that. I was also working on a math master's, and honestly, just having fun with that. We had really good friends, and that was one of the kind of more fun times. I did still suffer from workaholism. I was kind of defining myself too much based on how productive I was and how much work I was doing. So that was really still very central to how I viewed myself. And I don't think that's especially healthy. I've said that already. The employment situation was a bit precarious. These were year-to-year teaching contracts. So, you would kind of find out with just a couple of months lead time if you had a job or not for the next year, which was stressful. And again, in this time of my life, I was probably having too much to drink. So it was just what I was doing. I don't know. It was just kind of around, and these days I have a healthier relationship with it, and it wasn't great, but it was. I want to be honest with you and tell you both some of the positives and negatives. Okay, so after that, while I was teaching physics, I had an opportunity to teach this course on energy, environment, and climate. I offered to teach it. Nobody else wanted to do it, so I took it on, and I learned about the Earth's climate system, and I learned about oceanography. Just through reading a bunch of textbooks and preparing this course. So my introduction to our field, broadly speaking, was teaching an undergrad course, which is I guess not a traditional entryway, but it worked out okay for me. So when the financial crash made my contract evaporate, I quickly kind of looked around for a PhD program, because that made sense to me. Like continuing along some academic path and getting a PhD position made sense to me. So I looked around, and I looked out so much. That's one of the things. I kind of can't believe how lucky I've been in my life in so many different ways. And this is one of the ways. So I only have this tiny picture of him. This is Taka Ito. So Taka is now a professor at Georgia Tech, and he's an oceanographer. He does a lot of biogeochemistry. And he's like the chillest, most relaxed person I've ever met. He's so smart and he's so generous and kind. Like I just could not have asked for a sweeter person as an advisor, and I got so lucky because he was just the right person for me. Um, and I think sometimes there's a push or a feeling that one should apply for these really competitive and intense programs like the MITs and the really places that are perceived as very prestigious. But those places aren't necessarily the right places, right? You kind of need a good support system. You like the culture, the research culture, and the support culture really seriously matters deeply. And when I got to this department, to Colorado State, to the atmospheric science department, both my advisor and everyone else was so supportive. My grad student colleagues, the other faculty members, it was such a healthy place, kind of emotionally healthy. Everyone had a good work-life balance. People were active. They would get outside and exercise and enjoy the outdoors. It was just kind of the complete opposite experience from Kentucky, from the University of Kentucky and astrophysics. I had good access to mental health services, and it just made all the difference. I was happier, and I had a better work-life balance, and I had better mental health because I was seeking out those services and seeing a counselor. And as a result, I was a lot more productive. Being productive is not the point. Like that's not necessarily the goal. The goal is to be well balanced and healthy. But that was one of the nice benefits from feeling so supported and from being in an emotionally healthy place was that, yeah, I was able to do my work. I actually did better work when I had a better work-life balance and less workaholism. So I think it's important to keep an eye on that. Um, that working all the time, working super hard and being a workaholic is not necessarily a recipe for doing good work. Uh, Paradoxically, sometimes you need to slow down and get a better balance. Um, there were some negatives there. So my wife, for many years, up until the past couple of years, has struggled with endometriosis, and that's can be a very severe chronic illness that causes a lot of pain, um, and other difficulties. And the chronic illness had kind of reached this point where it was getting pretty serious, and she needed occasional surgeries, and it was kind of very difficult to navigate our lives. We couldn't really go out that much and do anything. We were kind of stuck at home a lot, so the weekends were a lot of we were just at home. I would work on stuff. We would be there with each other. I put access to healthcare on there. My access was okay, but my wife's access to healthcare was not good there. So this is the States, obviously, so there's no NHS, and the access to healthcare and health insurance is very expensive and usually tied to having some kind of job. So my access was okay, but hers was not that great. I also have a bit of seasonal affective disorder, which I've definitely felt ramping up this month as the darkness encroaches and creeps up on us and the days get shorter. I've been struggling with that a bit, and Colorado, I struggle with that a bit too. So the about halfway into my PhD program, there was a bit of a curveball. So Taka here, and this is the rest of the research group. I got to mention Yohei Takano and Wei Ching Su. And so the curveball I got thrown was that Taka got a job offer at Georgia Tech, and he decided to move. Well, Steph and I thought about it really hard and decided to go with him. In fact, the whole research group here, which was small, but that's all of us, we all went with him. We wanted to stay with Taka. Like that's how important his support was to us. We wanted to, be in close contact with him and have that support. Like we all wanted that from him. And so we moved. We moved to Atlanta, Georgia. And that was where my son was born. Our son, Alex, there's a baby picture, a couple baby pictures of Alex. He's 9 now. Yeah, he was born in Atlanta while I was working at Georgia Tech. So this was I really wanted to like Atlanta. I wanted to, because I had lived, it had kind of been, the great big city off in the distance for my childhood. and young adult life. Like, oh, I thought it would be so cool to live there, but the reality was much different than what I'd pictured. So our son was born there. We had good access to health insurance because Taka secured me like an actual research position there. So we had good access to health insurance for both myself and my wife. I was able to finish my PhD, and that was so excellent to have that support. On the other hand, Steph had a really rough recovery from. So Alex was born by C-section, and she had a really rough recovery, and it was a bit traumatic because she was in a lot of pain, and it took many, many months to heal up properly. And I hope I'm not scaring anybody by saying that, but it can be, that can be intense sometimes. And having a baby is intense too. I wasn't prepared for how intense it can be. I don't think anybody can prepare you for that. It's just your baby needs you like constantly a lot. And it's difficult to, you can't really find any balance, I don't think, in your life because your baby just needs you all the time. So yeah, the recovery was rough. Atlanta also suffers from this really bad income gap. So for example, it's hard to find a place to live, which is somewhere in between, um, let's say, like a place where, you know, you might not necessarily feel like you want to live, and a higher end kind of place. There's not much of a middle ground. There's a big, big income gap and not much in the middle. So you sort of feel the tilt of this. You sort of feel that sharp gradient, and you can see it in the city too. The city has these huge areas which are very poor and run down, and not maintained, and having really a hard time. And then other areas which are super wealthy, and you know, gigantic towers and really fancy malls, um, and so this was my first experience living in a big city in the US, and that income gap was really like in my face. uh, Atlanta traffic is also really horrible. Like, you know, it could take a couple hours to get between my house and Georgia Tech sometimes, just because and even with public transit helped, but it still could take, you know, a long time. So the commute was pretty awful. um yeah, so Taka, actually, the reason that I'm here in the UK now is that Taka forwarded me an email. This was just happenstance, right? He forwarded me an email of a position at Bass for a postdoc. And I received it. I applied. I didn't think anything of it, right? I thought, oh, there's no way. I'm not going to get this. This is a long shot. You know, working in Cambridge, like a Cambridge Institute, from where I was sitting, that seemed like, oh, no way. That's not going to happen, right? That's too good to be true. So I applied. I did the interview. Talked to Emily Schuttberg is the person who interviewed me, and apparently I must have did okay because she offered me the job, and you know, Bass offered me the job, and we were really thrilled. Um, we we weren't sure if we wanted to stay in Atlanta. It really didn't quite seem like the right place for us in the long run, and we were really excited to try a new place and to try a different country. So we said yes, and we sold. We actually had bought a house in Atlanta. We sold it, um, and used that money to hop over here. So we rolled the dice, and we said, yeah, let's roll the dice. Let's go to the UK. So we moved. We packed. We sold our house. We sold a lot of our stuff. We moved over here in 6 suitcases back in 2013. Stayed in Clare Hall when we first arrived, and eventually landed out here in Camborne, which is where I am now. That top right picture is from Camborne. So that's Steph on the right. There's Alex, and another American friend, Anna Harper, and her daughter Emmeline. So Anna is another American who lives in the UK. She's over in Exeter. She worked at the Met Office for a while. So somehow a lot of our American friends have ended up, you know, moving to the UK, either apparently permanently or temporarily over the years. There's been a big draw there. And on the bottom, this is what the front of Bass used to look like. This is the old reception, just in case you haven't, you know, some of you will not have seen that. So that's the old reception there. So yeah, we were super excited to be in a new country, have access to healthcare, to the NHS. The NHS is huge. I kind of can't emphasize enough how good it is to have access to good healthcare, which does not rely on your employment, that does not rely on what kind of job you have, and that also doesn't cost you hundreds to thousands of dollars every procedure. That does take a huge burden off of our life. I mean, there are still stressful things about dealing with NHS, right? You do need to learn how to navigate it, and over the years, Steph did have to learn um, how to apply pressure in an appropriate way, how to signal that no, I really need help. Like, I really need you to help me with this. You can't be too quiet. You have to advocate for yourself a bit. That was our experience with the NHS anyway, but you can get there eventually, it seems. And I've been so thrilled to have such great colleagues. This is another positive of working at Bass. I've just, I really like the Polar Oceans team that I'm in. They've been so supportive all along the way, and so in my corner. I've very much appreciated that, and not just Polar Oceans. I mean, he was a great example of an excellent colleague to have, and just somebody who's good to know and good to have around. So I've been so thrilled with that. There were some negatives. So the immigration hurdles are pretty. Oh my gosh, they're stressful and expensive, and Bass has helped me with those a lot over the years. But they are stressful things to jump through. And since 2013, when I moved here, it just felt like every now and then they would decide to double the fees. They would make it twice as expensive. Which I don't know. When they're doing these things, it's clear that they're sort of well, how do we make this more expensive to kind of? It feels like they're trying to discourage immigration. And by making it more and more expensive, and sometimes doubling the cost of even applying for the visas, and putting in the NHS surcharge and things. I mean, well, so that's kind of, that can be especially difficult for if you're like a scientist, working on a Bass salary, trying to support a family, and where you don't necessarily obviously have tons and tons of extra money to throw around. And yet you need these things to work here, right? Like, I needed the visas and immigration approvals to be able to keep my family here, and to keep my job. So that there wasn't really anything obvious waiting for me back in the States. There's not some default I can just go back to. There's not some life waiting for me there. We've built our life here, and we want to stay here. And so it has become so important over the years for us to clear those immigration hurdles. I put precarious employment in there. There was a period where I was on fixed term contracts, and that is stressful. It's stressful to have that clock ticking over your head. It's hard to deny that it's hard to have that fixed term clock ticking over your head. So it has taken a really long time, and it's been quite at times a very stressful journey. I did manage to eventually secure an open-ended position here, but it did take quite a lot. And the other negative is we're pretty far from family, and that has put some strain on the relationship between myself and Alex's grandmother, one of my mom, and we're so far away, and my mom has some health conditions, so it makes it really tricky. She has never been over here to visit. It's just hard for her to stay involved and feel involved when she's so far away and we're so far away, and the travel is difficult. So that's been one of the negatives. But I'm really happy to be here, honestly. And our son Alex, so he's autistic, and he's so well supported in school. The school system where we are is set up so nicely for that, and we're so grateful to be in a place that properly supports autistic people through their educational journey. And when I say properly supports, I mean certainly compared to the States, and certainly compared to Bullitt County, Georgia. I don't even want to think about what his experience would have been like in Bullitt County, Georgia, where I grew up as an autistic person. I sometimes suspect I might be autistic, maybe, but I don't have a diagnosis, and I'm not really sure. It's just a suspicion I have. And at some point when you get older, it's really hard to get a diagnosis, and it's really hard to, because you've spent so many decades, changing your behavior, or kind of putting layers on top of your underlying behavior. So it can be difficult to diagnose that sort of thing when you're an adult. Yeah, so I don't have a lot more to say. You know what? That's not true. I could talk a long time. I'm sorry. I could, but I don't want to keep you all morning. So I just really briefly wanted to say that it was a real privilege to get to go down to the Weddell Sea and to stand on some sea ice and to use this hand-operated ice corer to drill some sea ice cores and out of an old chunk of Weddell sea ice. Those cores then made their way back up here to Bass, and I was given permission to go into the lab and cut them up in the ice core lab and melt them and measure them in the salinometer. And I didn't do the science with them in terms of putting them in a paper. That eventually a researcher called Alexander Howman did that at Princeton. And it's cool to look at some of his scatter plots and know that, like, oh, that was some of the ice that we took, some of the ice that we cored out of the Weddell Sea ice. It's now just like a dot on his scatter plots. And that's one of the things that I like about having had that fieldwork experience is it made it very concrete for me that, oh yeah, every data point and every that you see on a graph from an observational standpoint, like a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and planning went into securing that data point, that it looks so innocent and innocuous just on a scatter plot with all the other data points. But it's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears could have potentially gone into collecting that data point. And honestly, the crew were this is a picture of me doing it. The crew were the real heavy hitters there. I mean, I'm just turning a thing, but the crew really did the hard work of, getting us there and making sure we were all safe and that we roughly knew what we were doing so that we wouldn't fall into the Weddell Sea to our icy deaths. So thank you, crew, for keeping us super safe during that expedition. It's very well appreciated. So Geraldine and Donna, they mentioned that they might like to hear a little bit about the podcast. So I thought I would say a little bit about the podcast here at the end of the talk segment. So I do this long format conversational podcast with scientists, and I started it a couple years ago. I guess I'm shifting gears quite a bit here now. This is pretty different from the last part of the talk. So I started this a couple of years ago because I really love talking with and learning from researchers, from scientists. I love the kind of just casual conversations you can have with researchers, especially the friendly ones, which in my experience, most of them are pretty friendly. Most of them, at bare minimum, they like talking about what they do, and they like the opportunity to say a little bit about their life and their experience. So I have access to these excellent open-hearted scientists, which is a real privilege, and that privilege has just come through the professional network that I happen to be in. And I also, I have this mild addiction to long format podcasts. I listen to a lot of them when I'm washing dishes or doing some other boring task. And so I kind of felt like, well, if I like these, there must be some other people out there who would like them as well. So these are some of the guests I've had on. These are just all lovely people. I've really enjoyed talking with them. Susan Lozier, who's the AGU president now. She was president-elect when I talked to her. I think she's properly the AGU president. And this is David Marshall. He's an oceanographer at Oxford. Super friendly guy. Sonia Legg, she's an inspiration, absolutely. And this is Jonathan Lilly. We did this meditating for scientists episode that I'm really proud of, that we explored some territory that you don't normally get to explore with other scientists about meditation and different kind of practices and different old wisdom and things. It was really a fun chat to have with him. So it's just literally called Climate Scientists. And I decided to go with that kind of boring name because it just tells you what it is. Just clearly, I'm all for good, like, pun-based names. That's amazing. If you have a good pun-based name, that's fine and great. More power to you. But I just wanted to clearly say what it was. It's about half science content and half pathways into science. And when I say long format, format. I don't know. You can just put it on the background. It's fine, right? You don't have to sit there and actively listen for 2 hours. Conversational, I do very minor editing. And I don't have a slide on this, but I noticed Caitlin was with us, and maybe you saw the email or tweets and things yesterday. So Caitlin, a few months ago, had this great idea to do a mini series on scientists with disabilities. So she's my co-producer on that. So we co-produced a few episodes, and we have at least one more waiting. It's in the can. We co-produced a few episodes highlighting scientists in our field who with disabilities, and giving them an opportunity to share their experience and to highlight ways in which that our field, that broader field, could better support folks with disabilities and lower some of those artificial effort barriers and make it more inclusive. I don't know. I've got a couple more slides, but this is the feedback I've received about the podcast. So I hope this doesn't sound too braggy. I'm telling you what people have told me. I'm just relating it to you, that like people have told me that it promotes a sense of community for them. They feel like they're kind of a little bit more aware of how the community works, because I think they can hear some of those casual conversations. And I don't know what your experience has been like, but I mean, that is when I did start to kind of feel like I was a bit more in the research world, was when I could just listen to and have casual chats with people. And I like the idea of making the inner workings of academia a little less opaque. You know, we live in a strange cult. That was a tweet somebody put out this morning. Was their kid asked them if they found their graduation robes, their PhD graduation robes, and they asked them like, "Mom, are you in a cult?" And we sort of are, right? It's academia is a kind of cult, kind of, not really, but you know, we have our moments. And my favorite part about doing the podcast is it gives these amazing people, my guests, a platform to share their experiences and their passion. And I just like that. I just like letting these people like shine and letting these people kind of share who they are with the world, because these are the folks doing the science. These are the folks who drive the whole thing forward. And without them, you know, without them getting up every morning and getting to it and doing it, we wouldn't have science. So I'm so thankful for these people, and I'm so thankful for a platform to give them an opportunity to, you know, share who they are with the world. Does this matter? This is just the audience. I put some of these I added quite late last night, and now I'm like wondering if I even need them. Students, the research community, you know, those who want a closer look at how science actually happens, and then I get episode specific listeners sometime. My highest play count is for Michael McIntyre, who's a mathematician up the road at Dampt. But there's also a comedian named Michael McIntyre, so I'm pretty sure people are searching for Michael McIntyre and they're clicking on that episode, and then they're navigating away quite quickly when they realize, like, this is not what I was expecting. That's fine. It's okay. You know, I need to change the title on this. This isn't. Let's change the title now together. This is not "Should I Start a Science Podcast?" But I think this is kind of like, okay. I hesitate to give advice, so I'm going to say advice with an asterisk. But I do like the idea, to the extent that you can. It's when you have a creative project or when you're trying to kind of formulate a career. If you can go with something you love, if that's possible, if it's an option. Um, you know, it's depends a bit on what you love, I guess, and whether that can be turned into a career. But I grew up. I had this great this aunt whom I really loved, and her name was Aunt Corrine. And so she never married. She lived by herself. You know, throughout her whole life, she loved bowling, and she loved. She worked in banking. She worked in credit, and the advice that she gave me about working, which I must have taken to heart because I really still believe it. That she said that, well, you're going to spend so much of your time working. You're going to spend so much of your life at work. And like, yes, it's important to have a good work-life balance. But that being said, if you can work in something that you like or love, or at least don't hate, you at least at bare minimum, you need something you don't hate. Then that can make such a difference to how you feel in your life, because you are going to be spending so much time doing it. So for me, it was so valuable to try to find something that I love doing and to try to turn that into my career. And it looks like that's working, maybe. It has not been easy, and it's been filled with lots of uncertainty and lots of stress. Would I recommend it to others exactly? I'm not sure. I don't I don't know if I would, but it's kind of working. And I'm really thankful for that. I feel really grateful to have that opportunity. Um, anyway, so yeah, the rest of the point about there being no rules, that's true for a podcast. That's probably not true for building your career or your life, but for building a podcast, you can do whatever you want. I do like the last thing about trying to do things your way. Try to like own your perspective as much as possible, and to be because that way whatever you do will be more unique, and it will be more authentic, and um, it will hopefully help you feel more comfortable in the world, because you can really kind of find your little niche in it. You can find your place to be. Okay, so I'm rambling too much. I think I'll wrap up there, and maybe we'll I think we have a little bit of we do some questions and stuff, right? If I remember right.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. That was fantastic. And like as Dan said, he's got this podcast. So for anyone who found that listening to his voice just then nice and soothing, then definitely go back and jump in. And because they're all there on the website, you can listen back. Don't listen to the one that I'm on, because that's my voice and you've heard that enough. But also, if any of you are really keen to get in touch with Dan and contribute either to some of these special ones, or just in general, if you're doing something that you might want to talk about, then get in contact with Dan, because it's a really good experience, because he doesn't even tell you when the interview started. He just kind of lulls you into a false sense of security and gets you talking about your childhood or something, and it's a bit like therapy, so it is well worth it.
I'll stop recording now, by the way.
Yeah.